after they reported like.
Good afternoon. Welcome to April 2024 edition of the St. Lawrence County's Lunch and Learn webinar series. I'm Laura Pearson. I'm the Business Development Coordinator of the St. Lawrence County Chamber of Commerce. This monthly educational webinar series is made possible by the generous support of St. Lawrence University and Clarkson University, who are leadership circle sponsors of the Chamber. I would also like to introduce Katie Berry, our Canton Community Coordinator and Communication Specialist at the St. Lawrence County Chamber, who is providing my tech support for today. Thank you, Katie. Before I introduce today's presenter, I want to run through a few items. First, your mics have been muted and your webcams have been disabled. But if you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to type them into the chat window and we will do our best to answer them. Please note that this session is being recorded for the purposes of broadcasting it on our webinar archive and YouTube channel, which is named SLC Chamber NY. After the presentations are complete, we will open the floor for any Q&A. We do keep the webinars to under an hour so you can get back to work. Are you interested in presenting or have a topic you would like to see presented? Please let me know. I would like to introduce and welcome our esteemed presenter, Sharon Van I can't say it.
Auken.
Okay. I knew I was going to mess it up, Sharon. Business advisor, human resources consultant from CITEC Business Solutions. Sharon, thank you so much for presenting today, and I will turn the mic over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Laura and Katie. Let's see if I can get my presentation up here, right? Let's see. All right. There we go.
You did it.
We're almost there.
Almost there.
There we go. Okay. So welcome, everyone. I appreciate your attendance. I see quite a few names that I recognize. Appreciate you joining us today. So the topic that I was asked to speak on is delivering constructive feedback, which is a huge topic. I'm sure that's why there's pretty good attendance today. And much of what I'll talk about is in the context of dealing with personnel situations. My background is in human resources. I work for CITEC Business Solutions, as you can see on the slides here. Many of you probably already know, we are based in Potsdam, but I actually live in the Adirondacks, and we cover the North Country, delivering training and consulting services. So as I mentioned, my background is really in HR, and therefore, a lot of what I bring to CITEC is leadership management training, other soft skills types of training, and HR consulting as well. And this is certainly one of the key topics. This is part of our management development program. Again, I'm going to speak, some of the examples I'll use will be in the context of personnel or employee situations that might arise, but really much of the guidance I'll give you around delivering constructive feedback you could use in any situation with any kinds of relationships at work or outside of work. I'd like to mention one thing, and it's interesting because I think, as you can see out on my title slide here, I call it constructive feedback, quote, constructive feedback. But often you see that referred to as constructive criticism. And I purposely take out the word criticism and insert feedback because I think criticism has a negative connotation. And I think feedback is really a positive thing. Even when you are delivering it in the sense of positively, trying to reinforce positive behaviors that you want to see in your employees or in other relationships, or you are trying to correct someone's something they are doing wrong, it can still be a positive thing. And that's why I prefer to call it constructive feedback as opposed to constructive criticism or something like that. So you'll hear me use the word feedback and not criticism throughout. Another term that people often use for this type of topic is difficult conversations, how to have a difficult conversation. Again, I lump it right into the same thing. It's all delivering feedback in one way or another. And I believe you can really make that a positive thing. And that's what you want to do. So we could talk all day about this topic. Unfortunately, we only have an hour, so I tried to boil it down to as concise a way of presenting this to you as I could, really hitting just the high points and giving you some concrete steps that you can take away and understand how to deliver feedback more easily. And I mean that in both ways, actually, more easily for you as the one who has to deliver it, and also for the recipient who's on the other end and has to hear the feedback, which again is sometimes hard to hear. Sometimes we don't want to take feedback, but I believe if you practice some of the things I'll talk about, it will be easier for both parties and the feedback will be better received. So this first slide shows you some guidelines, and I think these are the key points to really kind of the magic sauce, if you will, for delivering feedback that is received in the best way possible. So the first thing is to respond in a timely manner. And what that means is, obviously, if we let problems fester, whatever kind of problems they are, whether they are our own frustrations with someone else or they are performance issues with an employee, they're not going to get any smaller. They are just going to get bigger. Usually we're going to get more frustrated, probably. And the person that you might want to give the feedback to may be completely unaware that there's even an issue. So the sooner we can tackle having this conversation, the better, and the better the outcome will be. I also think planning is an important step, even if you're going into a positive feedback session. Planning it through really helps you get your thoughts together, which is going to increase your confidence in delivering the feedback. And it's also going to make you convey the feedback in a way that is more clear to the person receiving it. And one of the ways that I like to plan it out is to do what I call scripting, or it's not what I call it, it is a technique called scripting. And it's not, as the name might imply, where you write out exactly what you're going to say and then you read off your script. That's not what it is. Scripting instead is just jotting down on paper what the problem is so that it's very clear in your head what the issue is and why this is a problem. Let's say, for example, you're trying to give some feedback to someone who is coming in to work late every day. Obviously, there's probably an impact to you and to the other team members as well. So by planning ahead that you're going to include that information and the impact, the consequence, that can make it so you don't forget to say that and also help you get your thoughts in order. The other advantage of planning it out is that you can anticipate what the receiver might come back with. So often, I know when I was in a specific HR role and trying to deliver feedback, the employee would deflect or make an excuse or say, well, yeah, but everybody does that, or something like that, have some sort of excuse. You can avoid that, or at least have a response if you plan out generally what you're going to say ahead of time. Again, it's not that you're writing out exactly word for word what you will say, but you just get your thoughts on paper. That's really what scripting is. And then you include the impact and what you would like to see the person do differently after the feedback. So planning that out ahead is important. Provide feedback in private whenever that's appropriate. Now, obviously, if you are in the workplace and you see a safety issue, somebody is like leaning back in their chair or something like that, you might just give feedback in passing, and that's perfectly fine. But if you are really going to need to correct someone's performance or give them some other more constructive, bigger feedback, you want to do that in private so that they aren't embarrassed or uncomfortable about that. So that can be an important consideration. For any of you who may have children, you probably know the fourth point there is important. Same thing with delivering feedback in the workplace. don't compare that employee to other employees, or say, why can't you be like so-and-so? Because that's only going to be demoralizing to the recipient. They're going to feel bad before you even deliver the concrete feedback. So don't compare to others. And the last point is probably the most important one, and that is to be specific in the feedback that you give. When you can include examples, that's even better. If you can pull out a report, let's use our example of the person who's tardy every day. If you can pull out a report, payroll or whatever, that shows how often they've been tardy in the past week or the past month, that concrete data and an example, and maybe even an example of why that's a problem to the rest of the team. Now we've missed a deadline, or so-and-so had to stay late because you were not here on time. When you can use specific examples like that, it's much easier for the recipient to know exactly the behavior that has to change or the conduct that has to change. Without that, if we're too vague or we use terms that are too vague, like attitude, the person is going to leave the feedback session and not really fully understand what it is they need to do differently. So spend time thinking about how you can be as specific as possible with the feedback that you deliver. So those are just some very broad guidelines, but will definitely help to deliver feedback in the way that it's most concrete and will be received in the best way possible. This next slide shows you a formula for actually having the discussion. And I think these are the key steps to actually sitting down with somebody and having that constructive feedback conversation or discussion. So the first thing is to describe what the person is doing right now. What is the current behavior? Again, if it's tardiness, that's pretty straightforward. Again, if you can back that up with your examples of how many times this week was it, how many times the past month, what is the current situation? And then ask for the employee's input. As you'll hear me say in a little bit, this should be a two-way discussion, not just one way, not just you delivering the feedback, but actually using questioning techniques and other ways to prompt the other person to participate in this discussion. Let's talk about this. Let's explore why this is a problem, or let's explore why this is exactly what we want everybody else to do, if it's something positive. So ask them for some input or an explanation. And as we'll talk about in a second, the way you deliver that, the way you actually say that to them can have a big impact over just the words that you say. You can deliver very negative feedback in a way that the recipient is not going to feel horrible about it. I know it seems like a stretch, but you really can do that. And it's all about how you say it. That's really all it is. So there have been situations, as an example, when I have had to talk to employees about their performance. And I have said things like, and this would be the actual tone of voice that I would use. So help me understand how you arrived at that decision, or help me understand, how you analyzed the situation and made that determination. Again, you can say it in a way that doesn't put them on the defensive. And I think it is important to get their perspective and hear from them. The third step is to describe what you would like to see them do differently or do instead of what they did do. It could be as simple as if someone is doing a report for something in the office and they've done it in Word and you think it would be better, or it needs to be in Excel or some other application. That is what you want to tell them in step 3. This is how you need to do it. If they can choose to do that, then that's fine, but you need to explain what it is that you need to see them do differently. And then the 4th step is to ask them for some suggestions. I had an example last week in a class that I taught that I thought was pretty funny, where, again, it's that tardiness problem that I hear often. And the manager I was working with said that he actually went out and bought his employee an alarm clock, the kind which I've never seen, but the kind that actually jumps off the dresser and goes across the room. So you have to get out of bed and go get it. This manager told me that didn't even work. But the step 4 is really to explore with the employee or the person you're giving feedback to. Okay, what are some concrete ways that we can get you to be here on time every day, or to work more effectively with your coworkers? You know, break down what are some of the specific issues. Again, it's a two-way conversation. And then the last step is very critical, because if we give this feedback and then we don't follow up with the other person, normally I would ask all of you, so what would happen? What would happen is they are more likely to fall back into their old behaviors, and or maybe even not change anything. If coming out of that feedback conversation wasn't clear to them what they need to do differently, they won't change at all. So we do need to follow up and check in with them and make sure that the behavior is changed, or whatever it is that needed to change has, and also that they feel comfortable, that things are going well for them. The other benefit of the check-in is that the person you've given feedback to feels like you care. And that's such an important part of making sure that you are building strong teams. You're building good relationships with employees, and you're building strong teams. And relationships with anybody for that matter. So by checking back in, it lets people know that you really do care about them. So that's a very important step. Just a few points I wanted to make in general about giving feedback, a couple I've touched on. Again, as I said, it's best if this is a two-way conversation. It's not just you giving the feedback, kind of like might happen in a performance review, for example. This is should be a two-way conversation, and you really want to hear from the employee or the person that you're giving feedback to. You also want to very clearly communicate what you expect. How do they need to change their behavior, what they're doing, the tools they're using? What has to change very specifically, and what do you expect? Anytime you can reinforce positive behaviors or give positive feedback, that also goes a long way toward building a cohesive team, helping people. Other employees are going to see that. So when you reinforce the positive behaviors, hopefully they will also take note of that and participate in those same behaviors. Again, I mentioned questioning. Many of you may have heard of, or if you've been in my classes, you've heard me talk about open-ended and closed-ended questions. So you want to use open-ended questions in this situation. Closed-ended are the kind of questions you ask that the person would really be able to only respond with yes or no. But open-ended questions, you will be able to get more information from someone. So just to give you a very simplistic example, if you were to say to someone, "Did you have a good weekend?" they can only answer yes or no. So that's a closed-ended question. On the other hand, if you were to say, "Tell me what you did this weekend," that opens the door to them being able to share much more information with you. So when you are trying to have a feedback conversation with someone, you want to ask open-ended questions to get more information from them about why this is happening, why they are doing what they're doing or not doing what they're supposed to be doing, and so on. And then lastly, it also helps to ensure that both parties understand what the feedback is and why it's important. And you might need to use techniques like reflecting and clarifying to make that happen, or even just asking the receiver of the feedback to paraphrase back what, based on this conversation, they need to go and do differently. Now, obviously, if we're talking about tardiness, it's pretty straightforward. But if you are you're trying to give feedback to someone, maybe because it seems like their skills aren't up to par, and your feedback conversation has been about having them take some additional training, you want to be sure that they are clear about when they're supposed to have that training done, how do they go about signing up for that training, and then when are you going to follow up with them? And that really brings me to another point of having some time frame noted in which you'll follow up with them. So it's clear to them how much time they have to work on something and when they can expect to sit down with you again to go through the feedback again. I mentioned how important how you say something is. There is a term you may have heard called paralanguage. Again, I go over this in some of the classes that I teach. It's a type of body language in a sense, because it's not our verbal communication skills. It's more like the tone with which we speak, the emphasis with which we speak, volume, speed of our speech, things like that. That's paralanguage. That all really matters when you're talking with someone else, and many times even more than the words do, the words that we say. You can put someone on the defensive very quickly just with your tone of voice. I'm sure we've all been in situations like that, either on the receiving end of that or maybe even realizing or getting some feedback ourselves that we come across that way. I've had a couple managers in training classes that have said they're actually in the class because they were told to be in the class, because the way they speak to people is not helpful. And that's a perfect example of what I'm describing here. So pay attention to that, even practice ahead of time. If you have to have a particularly difficult conversation with someone, practice in front of a mirror. Try to speak with the tone that you will use as you talk to someone, because it will matter in the way the feedback is received. As much as you can keep your voice calm, that will help. And it will also help you have confidence in that situation. I also think trying to put ourselves in the employee's shoes or the other person's shoes helps. It helps you empathize with them. I know that can be maddening if you have an employee who has done something wrong, and especially if you know that they're capable of more than that or better than that. It's really hard to empathize and try to understand. But the more you can come across that way, the better the conversation will go, the easier it will go. Easier for you, easier for the recipient too. So try to approach it that way. Try not to use terms that are loaded with emotion, like angry, disbelief, furious, words like that are going to make the other person feel worse, and also possibly they can come across as being accusatory. So we have to watch how we say something in addition to the actual words that we use. Here's another point too, again, in terms of how we say something. When you begin a sentence with the word you, for example, you made a mistake the other day, it immediately sounds accusatory to the recipient. And even for you, when we say something like that, we're more likely to put the emphasis on the word you, just because that's how we speak. And again, that is going to alienate the other person really quickly. They're going to have their defenses up before you've even gotten into the feedback. So if we can start a sentence with I instead, so we take ownership of that feeling and what we're going to convey. So using the example I just gave you, we might say, I believe that you made a mistake last week. Can we talk about that? Let's take a look at that. Again, you're starting that sentence with I believe, or I feel that that was not the right approach to take. When you start a sentence with I, you take ownership of that, of the feedback you're going to give, as opposed to making it sound more like an accusation. So practice that. It's not easy. These things don't just roll off our tongue that way. It's much more, we feel more like we want to say, you made a mistake. But that's going to set the conversation up on the wrong foot right from the get-go. I mentioned before, using emotional words and trying not to do that. Again, trying to keep your tone and the words that you use more calm and direct, but not angry or loaded with emotional impact, if you will. And again, try to express some sense of understanding and empathy rather than being in disbelief that the employee did this, even though that might be how you feel, but the conversation is not going to go as well if you start right out with those words. Checking for understanding is an important aspect of giving feedback also, because, and this has happened to me many times, I think I'm being very clear in what I'm saying when I deliver feedback, but then the employee or the other person leaves the meeting and doesn't do what I asked them to do, or doesn't change anything. And I've learned to make sure that they confirm for me they know what I'm saying and they know what they have to go back and do differently. That's the key. So there are different ways that you can do that. You can ask them to paraphrase back what you agreed upon, making sure that they have a chance to have input. And I also strongly suggest, especially if you're talking about an employee situation, that you do ask them to come up with some ideas for solutions or for how they need to do something differently. They're much more likely to own it and to change if they have had input in the solution, or even maybe decided themselves what they need to do differently. But make sure that they do understand before they leave that meeting with you, that they know very clearly what they need to do different. And if there's any question, that they have a chance then to ask you, specifically what you mean or what they need to do differently. For any of you who have been in my classes, I really am a big advocate of documentation, and even short of documentation, a very specific action plan for what will be done. And that can look like something very simple, like that example of our employee that we're asking to use an Excel spreadsheet instead of a Word document. That's pretty straightforward. But anytime you can back that up with something in writing, I think it's not only provides a paper trail, but it also, something about our brain makes it stick better when we have something in writing. So one of the things that I do whenever possible, when I am coming out of a meeting that I have led, is to send an email to that individual I met with and say, okay, I appreciate you meeting with me. Glad, we had some good discussion. These are the 3 points that I just want to recap we covered, and we'll circle back in 30 days. So, and you might even say, is that your understanding? If that's appropriate. So you have a paper trail there, you have an email. It doesn't have to be very long, but it's just recapping what was covered. And it provides an anchor for both parties, something to hang on to, maybe print out, at least have available. The other thing with that type of situation, you may have employees that don't have email. I know I work with lots of people like that. So even if you were to just write out a note and give that to the employee and say, I just wanted to recap our meeting, really appreciate you taking the time to sit down with me. This is what I understand you're going to work on, and we'll circle back in 30 days, and that will be on, May 10th, and so on. Having some kind of a concrete action plan eliminates the problem of that person leaving the meeting with you and not having a clue what to do differently or where to start. And I know it sounds so simplistic, but I have seen this happen again and again. So some formal action plan, even if it's simple, goes a long way toward helping the employee to own what they need to do differently more. And it provides the automatic opportunity for that follow-up that I described. So if you've set a future date, then it's right there in black and white. That's when you'll follow up with them. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that you can't follow up in between now and then. Obviously, if somebody is working on something over 30 days, you probably want to check in with them, after a few days and just say, hey, how's that training going that you were taking, or that we decided you would take? Or, how are you doing? How's it coming with the Excel spreadsheet? Those kinds of things. Again, that makes people feel like you care and like you are engaged in helping them not only do what you need to have them do differently, but also grow and help them develop for themselves. So I think I probably touched a little bit on most of this already, the follow-up piece. Once you've met, let's say that 30 days, you sit down with the employee again, or the other person that you've given the feedback to. Hopefully they've done exactly what they were supposed to do. And then you want to be sure to praise them, and maybe even reward them depending on what the situation is. And rewards don't have to be big. They can be little things. Even, there are so many ideas, little gas cards, flowers, little box of candy, so many things, but that builds positive reinforcement. And that individual is much more likely to do what you want them to do the next time around if they have felt that you are engaged with them and care about their development and their well-being. And then you follow through with that positive reinforcement. It keeps that cycle going. If the goals were not met, or they're still not performing the way they should be, then you just have to start the process over again and sit down and go through the constructive feedback again. And maybe then, you have to decide, maybe it becomes a discipline issue at that point. I think the biggest takeaway here is the last point of just simply not leaving anyone in the dark that you are working with, whether it's a personnel type situation or you're giving feedback to a family member. People want to know how they're doing. That is one of the key aspects of building relationships. They want to feel like that is working. So, ongoing feedback is a good thing, even if it's just touch points, as I call them. Also, I think it's helpful to, based on what you hear from the employee, when you ask them some open-ended questions, are there other resources you can provide them with to improve in what you're trying to give them the feedback about? Sometimes just the emotional support, that moral support, can be all they need. But other times, maybe it is training or mentoring, working with someone else, that kind of thing. And then lastly, I just wanted to touch on what I call creating a safe and open environment. And what I did actually have the title to this particular slide. It said something like create a routinely safe environment or something along that line. What I mean by this is the culture that you create on your team, in your department, and certainly even in a larger way, your whole organization should be such that people feel comfortable coming to you with issues, with concerns, and certainly if they've made a mistake or done something wrong. And when that environment is created, when that's the culture and people don't feel intimidated coming to you or to other managers, feedback becomes so much easier, both ways, for you and for the employees. It doesn't even really feel like feedback because it's just part of the culture. And that's ultimately where you want to get to, what you want to strive for. It's creating a culture where people are not intimidated to speak up, and they will come to you and just ask you, am I doing this correctly? Should I be doing this differently? Or they might even ask you to sit down and have a feedback conversation with them. They might welcome that. So that's what I mean by creating a safe and open environment. And that will build stronger relationships all the way around and a more cohesive team. So that's the high points, and very briefly of, delivering constructive feedback. As I say, we could spend 4 hours or more just talking about this topic, but I hope there's been enough that you can take away to implement in a concrete manner. And I know Laura is going to send out this slideshow, so hopefully that will serve as some reminders too. Laura, did you want to open it up for questions or conversation?
I would love to do that. Thank you so much, Sharon. This was really interesting. I was taking notes like crazy. I got a lot of people I need to chew out. So yeah, I'm ready to go now. I'm just kidding. Katie, can you turn the recording off for